Okay, cool. So, as I say, what I want to do in the second half here, first, I want to go through these four structures. Sort of every F is G, some F is G, not all F's are G's, and no F's are G's. I want to go through these because they're really important. Then, depending on the time, we might talk about some other cases where we have to worry about the scope of the quantifier, but it's not the end of the world if we don't cover those, because that's covered, I think, nicely in the book. And then we'll hopefully wrap up by talking about cases where we might need multiple quantifiers. So where we'll have predicates with multiple gaps and allow ourselves to have multiple quantifiers. So, but first, let's talk about these four. So we're going to go through them one at a time to make sure we get the structures here. And again, I want to stress the reason for doing this is these four structures honestly underlie so much of the kinds of things that we'll want to be able to capture. So it's useful to see these. So we'll start with, I should also mention, we're going to use this symbolization key all the way through. It's just a kind of jokey one. It's an easy way, I think, to kind of get a grip on the notion. Right? So our domain will be all dogs. We'll have capital H for the predicate is in the house, and capital T for is a terrier. So everybody knows what a terrier is, right? Is a kind of dog. Right? So we've got every dog in the house is a terrier. Let's start with that one. So how might we symbolize this? Right? First thing to note, it's got an every. So if it's got every, what does that automatically suggest? It's going to be a universal, right? If it's every, it strongly suggests it's going to be that universal. Because it's effectively telling us something like, hey, all of them. Right? And it says every what? Every dog in the house is a terrier. Now there's a strong temptation to write this as a conjunction. Right? That for all x, x is an h and x is a t. But this isn't right. This isn't right. Because what this tells us, this sentence says, every dog in the world, every dog, all dogs, are in my house and are terriers. Which is not true on both accounts, right? Again, if we have the conjunction attached, a universal attached to a conjunction, you're saying something very strong. You're saying that everything in the domain satisfies this conjunction. It satisfies both conjuncts. So this symbolization key doesn't track it. Instead, what we want to do is to say something about every dog that's in the house. Of those things, they're going to be terriers. So we capture this with a conditional. So this conditional tells us, this universally quantified conditional tells us, hey, for everything, if it's an H, if it's in the house, then it must be a terrier. And what happens for the dogs that are outside the house? Are they a problem? No, because the dogs outside the house make the antecedent false. And what's the truth value of a conditional with a false antecedent? Well, it's always true. So by putting this conditional, we avoid any of the worries about all of the dogs. All we need to pay attention to is what are the ones that satisfy the antecedent like. More generally, if you have a universal, you are very rarely going to have it attached to a conjunction. Because conjunctions are very hard to please. Universals are very hard to please. By attaching a universal and a conjunction together, you get something that's really damn hard to please. So, if we want to say every dog in the house is a terrier, we can use this universally quantified conditional. Or more generally, a sentence can be symbolized using this structure if it can be paraphrased in English as every F is G, where the F's and G's could be simple or complex as you like. So there's our first one. Now, how about the next sentence? Our next sentence, some dog in the house is a terrier. So if we hear some, what does that suggest? It's going to be our existential. It's going to be our backwards E. Now, in this case, based on what we just said, we might think, hey, it's the existential attached to the conditional. But note, this is not right. Why is this not right? Well, what's an easy way to make this true? It says, hey, there's at least one thing in the domain that satisfies the conditional. And we just mentioned, what's a really easy way to satisfy this conditional? Make the antecedent false. So if we go and just grab any dog you like that isn't in the house, it's going to make the conditional true, whether it's a terrier or not. So instead of using the conditional, we want to use a conjunction. We want to read some dog is in the house, there's some dog in the house is a terrier, as there is some dog that is both in the house and is a terrier. And when we put it that way, pretty obvious, right? We need to use our conjunction. So more generally, the thing to note is the existential is very easy to please. And since the conditional is also so easy to please, putting the two together gives you a sentence that's too damn easy. So most of the time, not always, but most of the time, if you have an existential, it is not going to be attached to a conditional sentence. It is going to be attached to a conjunction. So if we want to say some dog in the house is a terrier, we can use this structure down here. There's something that's both an H and a T. More generally, we can say this. A sentence can be symbolized using this complex structure if it can be paraphrased in English as some F is G. Again, F and G here can be as complex or as simple predicates as you like. So the things to stress. A rule of thumb, it's not guaranteed, but a good place to start. If you have a universal, it's probably going to go with a conditional to make it a little bit easier to make true. And if you have an existential, it's probably going to go with a conjunction to make it a little harder to make true, to make it more precise. Okay, so we've done every, and we've done some F is G. How about not all F's are G's? Or in this case, not all dogs in the house are terriers. Not all dogs in the house are terriers. Well, let's think, right? If we just read this literally, what is this saying? On its very surface, it says, it's not the case that, what? Yeah, right? It's not the case that every F is G. So there you go. There's an easy way to do it. Just literally take all the F's are G's, all the dogs are in the house, and stick a negation in front. If not all of them are, well, it's not the case that everyone is. But there's another way to do not all. Right? To do not all F's or G's. And we can think about it this way. If not all of the dogs are in the house, are terriers, right? Not all the dogs in the house are terriers. What does that guarantee? If not all the dogs in the house are terriers, what must there be? Isn't a terrier, right? Yeah, right? So again, if not all the dogs in the house are terriers, then there must be at least one dog in the house, something different. Maybe it's a pug. Maybe it's a Shar Pei, right? In other words, right, we can paraphrase this sentence as, there's a dog in the house that's not a terrier, or this existential. So the two ones in bold here are two different ways to capture not all the dogs in the house are terriers. Or more generally, there are two ways to capture not all F's are G's. Right? Again, the easy way is literally just, it's not the case that every F is G. Negate the universally quantified conditional. Or you have an existential attached to a conjunction and you negate the consequent. There's at least one thing that makes the antecedent true and the consequent false. Cool. So we now know how to do not all F's are G's. Now how about our second one? No dogs in the house are terriers. Right off the bat, if we know that no dogs in the house are terriers, that means it's not the case that there's at least one thing that's a dog in the house that is a terrier. Which again, hopefully you can see the structure there. It's literally just the negation of the sum. So if no F's are G's, well, then it's not the case that some F is G. But there's another way we can do this one too. And if we think about it for a moment, we can start to see it. Right? If no dogs in the house are terriers, then what must be true of every dog in the house? I'll say that again. If no dogs in the house are terriers, then what's got to be the case about every dog in the house? They're not terriers, right? So we can also express this last one with a universally quantified conditional. We do it as, for all x, if it's in the house, it ain't a T. Again, why? Because we know there's no pair of H and T's. Every H is not going to be a T. Every H is not a T. The fun thing is we can recapture all of these if you think about it in terms of Venn diagrams. The stuff we started with way back in the very, very first exercise that we did in the tutorials. What these quantifiers are doing is telling us, right, can we grab stuff from the overlapping circles? Or is there an overlap? Are they perfectly overlapping? Is one inside the other maybe? All of this quantification stuff is just another way to come at that idea. So we have two ways to do not all, the ones at the top, and we have two ways to do no, the two bold ones at the bottom here. Just like this. More generally, we can say a sentence can be symbolized as either one of these two, if it can be paraphrased in English as not all F's are G's, where F and G is as complex or simple as you like. And a sentence can be symbolized as these two, the negated existential conjunction, or the universal conditional with a negated consequent, if it can be paraphrased as no F's are G's. So, again, those four. Every F is G, some F is G, not all F's are G's, and no F's are G's. Those four structures are incredibly useful because what they're defining is the level of overlap between the predicates. And this is precisely the kind of stuff that we were missing. If you remember the argument we started today's lecture with. Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. We couldn't capture that because we couldn't talk about that overlap and we couldn't talk about specific individuals. With the quantifiers and names, we're now able to do that. Socrates is one of the members of this circle. Everything in this circle is embedded in the bigger circle. So Socrates must be embedded in the bigger circle as well. That only follows because of the extra expressive capacity that FOL gives us. Okay. So those four are really, really useful. And again, I wanted to be very careful and clear on those before we go any further. What questions do you have for me on those four? Some, all, not all, none. We good with those four? Again, we'll play around with them in the tutorials. We'll practice with this stuff. As with a lot of this, it's going to be easier as we continue along and you get some practice writing it. Okay. So, it's also worth noting some very helpful logical equivalences. In fact, they were implicit in what we were just talking about. And this has to do with the relationship of quantifiers and negation. If you have a quantifier immediately attached to a negation, you can play swapsies. You can change the order. You can push a negation through a quantifier or pull it back out through a quantifier. But when you do, you have to change which quantifier it is. So if you have everything is not A, that is equivalent to it's not the case that at least one thing is A. And those go back and forth, right? If everything's a non-A, then it's not the case that something is A. If everybody's not here this morning, then it's not the case that someone's here. Similarly, if there's at least one thing that's not A, then it's not the case that everything is. If there's at least one person who isn't here, then it's not the case that everyone is here. Make sense? There's also some slightly more complex logical equivalences, and we'll talk more about these as we go. But note that the negated universal conditional is going to be equivalent to an existential conjunction with a negated consequent. That's just what we talked about a second ago. Right? And similarly, the negated existential conjunction is going to be equivalent to the universal conditional with a negated consequent. That's just the two different ways to say not all or none. But note, these lean on equivalences between these kinds of things. We'll talk more about this as we go, but it's useful to see. Again, if you have a conjunction, a quantifier next to a negation, you can switch their order as long as when you switch the order, you swap the quantifier type. Okay. So there's a couple more things I want to quickly go through. I know I'm throwing an absolutely lot of stuff at you, but again, we're going to go nice and slow over the next 3 weeks to kind of pick it up. So I want to talk a little bit about paraphrase and quantifier scope. And first, tell you a little bit about Pokemon. Right? So recall that I said with regards to FOL, right, that names pick out exactly one thing in the domain, Well, I never said anything about predicates. Predicates can apply to some, all, or none of the things in the domain. And interesting things happen when we have a predicate that applies to none of the things in the domain. So to use the terminology, when we have an empty predicate, a predicate that is not satisfied by anything in the domain. So here's a jokey example. If we have the domain be people, and we have the predicate capital P be is a Pokemon, and capital C be is cute, right? How would we do all Pokemon are cute? So first things first, what structure is this an instance of? Well, it's going to use the universal quantifier, but does it look like any of the ones we just talked about? It's every F is G, right? Every Pokemon is cute. Every Pokemon is cute, right? So all Pokemon are cute, universal quantifier, conditional. Being a Pokemon is our antecedent, being cute is our consequent. Yeah. I mean, easy. Just specify it as whatever we want. Domains are just collections of objects, right? So the domain can be any collection of objects we like it to be. In this case, just pick the domain of people. So we get this. Again, that's just to say every F is G. Same structure we saw just a second ago. Right? Now, how would we do some Pokemon are cute? Right? Again, does this look like a familiar structure? Right? It's literally one of the ones we did just a second ago. It's some F is G. Right? That's the existentially quantified conjunction. Okay. Now here's something weird. In this case, the predicate P is empty. And the predicate P is empty because people ain't Pokemon, for better or for worse. Right? So given this domain, nothing in the domain satisfies the predicate P. Clear? Okay. So in that case, what's going to be the truth value of our two sentences? Well, first, let's start with the bottom one. Will that be true? Will some Pokemon be cute, given this setup? No, it can't be, right? It can't be, because the existential says at least one thing satisfies the sentence. But if we go and reach into the domain of people, we will not find anything that's both a P and a C, because none of the things we could grab are P's. People aren't Pokemon. Pokemon is an empty predicate given this domain. So 6 is false. What about 5? Here's something really weird. 5 is true. Why is 5 true? Well, 5 is going to be true because it is a universally quantified conditional. And what happens with conditionals with false antecedents? What truth value do conditionals with false antecedents have? They're always true. They're always true. So in this case, right, if you have a domain set up such that you can do a conditional with an empty predicate as the antecedent, the conditional will be true. But it will be true in a kind of cheap way. We will say this, right? When F is an empty predicate, that is, when you have a domain such that it makes the predicate not satisfied by anything in the domain, every sentence of the form for all X fx conditional, and we don't care what comes in here, will be vacuously true. That is, it will be true because everything makes that antecedent false. Now, the upshot here, the reason why this weirdness follows, is because of the weirdness of our material conditional, of that arrow. Remember, as we talked about last week, 2 weeks ago even, right? Conditionals are weird. And if we think about the promise and breaking the promise, there's no way for me to break my promise if I'm sick. I could show up and teach, or I could stay home. Either way, I'm still keeping my promise. If I'm healthy, then I'll come and teach class. It's just a little jokey example to drive home this idea. We sometimes will need to be careful about the combination of predicates and domain that we have. The domain might make the predicate empty, which will then have knock-on consequences for various structures. Okay. So that's the big stuff that I wanted to go through. I'm going to skip a little bit here about paraphrase and quantifier scope, which is sad because I love talking about Marco, but that's fine. Does everybody know Marco? Yeah, it's a shame he's retired now, right? Anyone interested in that section? Again, Tim does a really nice job in the book, and I'm very happy to talk about some of that in the tutorial, but I want to make sure we cover the multiple generality stuff before we go. So, note that everything we've done so far has featured single quantifiers, possibly with one object satisfying multiple predicates, right? But it's always been just one quantifier. Or maybe even better, predicates with only one gap. Yes, please.
So when we say universal quantifiers, when we go to the other way, like with that open system?
Well, so no, not with the way we're going to run this language. We're always going to have a specified domain. Now, it might be such that, here's an example. We can have the universal domain, where it's just literally everything that exists. And it's pretty clear we don't know all of the stuff that's in that domain. So we might not necessarily be able to list all of these objects, but we can still treat it as a complete domain. What we couldn't do is have an unspecified domain. Not open. In some sense, right? Because we can deal with open in the sense of it being epistemically open. That is, we don't know all of the stuff that's in there. But we can't deal with a domain that is indeterminate. It's a subtle difference, but it's important. And note, that's just the way that we've set up this language. Those assumptions we had about no empty domains and no empty names are simplifying assumptions for us to make this language work first. One of the things we'll talk about in the very last lecture is ways you can drop those and what happens when you do. Again, walking before running is the idea. So, to spool it back, right? So far we've dealt with just single quantifiers, sentences featuring one. But there's going to be cases when we're going to want multiple ones. In fact, I introduced you to the idea of variables with a case. Right? He loves her, but she doesn't love him back. So we can think about this in terms of the predicates. One-place predicates ascribe properties to a single entity. They've got one gap, and we fill that gap in with some object or name. Two-place predicates express relations. Loves is adjacent to right? Note in those cases that the weird noises I made also indicate different gaps, right? Different gaps. Three-place relations ascribe relations between three things. Is in between, right? The coffee cup is in between the viewer and the mouse, for example. There's theoretically no limit to the adicy of these predicates. We could have a 26-place predicate. God knows what kind of natural language thing it would be, but we could have it if we wanted to. We're basically going to be fine using 1, 2, and 3. Importantly, once we start to have more than one gap in these relations, we're going to need to not just figure out how to fill in the gaps, but we'll need to label the gaps themselves. Here's what I mean. We're going to want to do something like this. Right? We're going to want to indicate that one of these places is the lover, and one of these is the beloved. One of them is the one that sends the love out into the world, and the second one is the target of the love. The way we indicate this is we label the little gaps in our symbolization key. And the way we express this in our language is literally in the order of the names that we fill in. So if we wanted to write Finn loves Princess Bubblegum, right? Finn is taking the first gap, he is the lover, and Bubblegum is the beloved. So we'll write this first one, LFB. And this tells us, in the order of presentation, who's filling which gap. So this is why, if you go back, why we couldn't do something like H, A, and M. Right? When we have a one-place predicate, we can't put multiple names after it because then we're treating it grammatically like a relation. And that's not the way we do things. Right? So, okay. With that in mind, how would we write Finn loves Finn? LFF, right? LFF. Finn would take both spots and have LFF. Okay? How about Finn loves Princess Bubblegum, but Bubblegum does not love Finn? So it's going to be a conjunction, right? The but gives us a conjunction. And we have LFB, just like we had at the top. So how would we say, this is a good one. How do we say Bubblegum does not love Finn? Yeah. So we're going to write it like this, right? We'll have LFB, conjunction, and then it's not the case that Bubblegum stands in the loving relation to Finn. Again, this is the grammar telling us the order that they're filling the gaps in. The first one fills the first gap, the second one fills the second gap, and the negation tells us that relation does not hold in that order. Okay. So things to note. The negation here will not go inside the predicate, because the negation is not a term, so it can't be the kind of thing that we put in these gaps. The only thing that can go in those gaps are terms, variables, or names. Okay, and finally, how would we say someone is loved by Finn? Yeah, if we've got this someone, we're going to have to use the existential, right? So the existential is going to give us a variable. Here's the question. Where is the variable going to go? Is the variable going to go in gap 1 or gap 2? If we look at the English here, right, someone is loved by Finn. So who is the lover And who is the beloved? Finn is the lover, right? So this is going to be existential X, LFX, where the X is the object of the loving. It is the beloved.
Would this be, I mean, with someone we know it's a person, but would this be also specified domain, right?
Exactly, right? The only reason that this can be treated as someone is because we've made our domain as people. If we made it as universal, we would need to have more predicates. We would need to is a person and is loved by Finn. Okay, so far so good? So note, what we've already done is we've made it clear we can quantify into gaps in this relation, right? That is, we can say there's somebody that Finn loves. But there's no reason why we can't quantify into both places. So we could quantify into both and say someone loves themselves. How would we say someone loves themselves? Yeah, right? We could have the existential quantifier. Like that. Where the same object is going to be slotted into both the lover and the beloved. Now, here's a fun one. How would we say somebody loves somebody? Does this give us somebody loves somebody? No, because this is somebody loves themselves. So if we do somebody loves somebody, how many quantifiers are we going to need? 2 of them. And 2 different variables. Yeah.
Can we say your existential XY? We can.
No.
Or that's separate.
Separate existentials.
X and Y, and then alpha XY.
There we go. It's going to be like so. Universal X, sorry, existential X, existential Y, LXY. Right? Different variables for the 2 different existentials. And this tells us there's something X that loves something Y. In principle, because we have 2 different quantifiers, we can grab 2 different objects. There's 2 cranes going into our crane game. But there's nothing preventing it from grabbing the same object twice. If Finn loves Finn, that's an example of somebody loving somebody. Because Finn is a somebody. The difference here between these 2 is subtle, but it's fundamentally important. When we have the same variable in both spots, you have to fill in the lover and the beloved with the exact same object. But when you have 2 different variables, you have the option of using different things. The option. It's not required, but it's an option. Now, why is this interesting? Well, it lets us capture some very, very cool things. How would we say everybody loves somebody? Well, here's the oddity. There's at least 2 readings of this in English. One of the readings is for each person X, there's some person Y that they love. Everybody loves somebody. The second reading is there's some particular person X that every person Y loves. Everybody loves somebody. These are radically different sentences, and we can see it once we sketch out the quantifiers. Because how would we symbolize these? Our first one tells us that for everything in the domain, there's some y such that x loves y. Our second one tells us there is something in the domain X that everything in the domain loves. And we can see the difference here by thinking about an example. Our first sentence could be true of a love triangle. Ron loves Hermione. Harry loves Ron. Hermione loves Harry. God knows why. So A to B, B to C, C to A. Our last one, our bottom one, needs a center of attention. Ron loves Harry. Hermione loves Harry. Harry loves Harry. Selfish twat. These are different situations. And they can be captured only once we start to allow for multiple generality. Predicates that have multiple gaps and quantifiers quantifying into different gaps. Now, why is this interesting? Every number has a successor. I don't mean that there is some number that is bigger than every number. I mean that for each given number, there is going to be some number bigger than it. Without this multiple generality, we can't start to capture some of the basic things about mathematics. This is already a level of expressive capacity that we couldn't even come remotely close to in TFL. But you can also already see how the grammatical complexity has radically ramped up. The things to remember when we're starting with FOL, our base unit is always going to be a predicate and a term. We're always going to have a capital letter attached to some kind of lowercase letter. If it is a name, cool. We've already got a sentence. We've got the basic FOL sentence. If it is a variable, we need an attached quantifier to tell us how we can fill in the variable. How are we meant to replace it? That is the big lesson I want you to take away today. I also want you to know how to do those 4 basic structures. Every F is G, some F is G, not all F's are G's, no F's are G's. If we don't understand that, all the rest is just pointless. Okay, so next week, what we're going to do, next week, we're going to build on what we've learned. Specifically, we're going to learn about a very special predicate. So we're going to learn about identity and how it works. So again, if you have the time, give the book a read. We'll talk about all of these things during the tutorial. But importantly, take care of yourselves, and we'll see you later on this week.